What we're going to be talking about today is Connecticut's Indian Wars. And in the beginning, we don't think about this with Connecticut too much because, quite frankly, Native American presence in Connecticut was pretty much gone by about 1700, so very, very early on. But in the early part of Connecticut's history, there were a couple of fairly vicious wars, and believe it or not, the most, in one way, the bloodiest war in American history is actually King Philip's War. 1/3 of all of the colonists in New England actually died or were driven out during that time, and virtually 80 or 90% of all of the native tribes in the area were extinguished after King Philip's War. So there's some pretty bloody stuff going on in the beginnings of our history. We'll be talking about it today, but also a lot about the background of it, because a lot of it is a little bit strange to us, because quite frankly, Native American history is not something people get into too much. When we look at Native Americans, there are all kinds of ways of doing it. Traditionally, the view of Native Americans has always been about the same. Basically, the traditional view of Native Americans, right up until about the 1900s, was that Native Americans were just savage. And that's really where I get the title to my talk from. That they were merciless, right? They actually had rage when they went out and fought against people. But in the 1900s, we began to have a very different view of them. And then, of course, in the 1980s and 90s, this changes a great deal. And there are many reasons for this. If you guys have ever seen the movie Dances with Wolves, you can see kind of the difference. And what happens afterwards is that now Native Americans all of a sudden are kind of the very mystical keepers of the environment. And, it's Dances with Wolves. Everything was beautiful. Everybody was happy. Real estate costs were low, right? You had a lot of buffalo around you, so you could hunt them. But it's interesting because nowadays, of course, we have kind of a mixed view of them. So we still do see Pocahontas helping out John Rolfe when he's about to be killed in 1612. But then behind it, we always see lurking some of the most profitable casinos in the entire world. And I got to tell you, in 1976, when they brought that bingo game, right, to the Supreme Court, that was a major victory people didn't think about too much. We just want to give people a few dollars for their bingo. And then suddenly, right, the Mashantucket Center opens up, and it is very impressive even today. But the fact of the matter is, a lot of Native American history, for this reason, kind of escapes us. We don't look at it as real history. We look at it as kind of idealized one way or the other. The fact of the matter is, Native American history is very deep, very wide, and very complex. You see a map like this, and all these different areas and colors represent what they would consider to be different tribes. But I will tell you, folks, in 1492, it's estimated that there were 9,000 languages being spoken in what is now the United States. That's 9,000, right? So what you have is a huge melange of tribes. They're all over the place. They're in every conceivable environment. We have people who live in kind of rough deserts out here in the Great Basin. In the Southwest, before it started really drying up in the 1200s, you had major civilizations, mainly connected to the ones that were down in Mexico at the time. People living along the Northwest coast, people living a few on the plains, but in the Northeast, we also see some really not only advanced civilizations, but very crowded civilizations as well. In addition, a lot of these civilizations have much more contact with one another than we might think. What you're looking at right now in the red lines are actually trade routes that go through the United States at the time of the coming of Columbus. Now, what you would find is that in this whole area, you'd be very surprised if you were out here, right, in East St. Louis, area that was called Cahokia. You could have gotten Quetzal feathers from Guatemala. You could have gotten Inuit, that is Eskimo tool kits from the Arctic. You could have gotten flint from Minnesota. You could have gotten all kinds of products all over the United States. It was a huge area where people came together all the time. There was a lot of travel. There was a lot of trade. So there's a huge amount of interaction. And this is going to be one of the things that's important as a starter of the Pequot Wars. A lot of the reason for the Pequot Wars was economics, folks. Who's going to control trade? And what will they control trade of? Now, in the Northeast, right, we have a lot of tribes, but we also have land that's fairly hilly. Now, this isn't a surprise to anyone in the room. We live here, so we know. But what this is going to do is make for a huge number of tribes up in the Northeast that are slightly different from one another, They speak related languages. At times they speak other languages. But what's really interesting is that by the time of the 1300s or so, the lifestyle of the northeastern Indians, this is known as an eastern woodland lifestyle, is basically combining two things: agriculture. And in agriculture, you really have three crops that are very important: corn, beans, and squash. These are known as the trinity of Native American crops, for instance, or the three sisters, you might hear them called this. But they combine this with a hunter-gatherer lifestyle. And what this does is creates, here in the Northeast, massive population problems. By the 1200s and 1300s, Native Americans are overpopulating their areas. So if you think about it in this way, right? If we have, let's say, 10 people in this room, you probably can find a seat pretty easily. You have 100 people in the room, it's going to be a lot harder finding the seat. And what begins to happen is that in the Northeast, a new type of political organization begins to be seen. This type of political organization is very different from what we would see in Western civilization, which is really the heritage that we inherit. And that organization is known as the Confederation. All over the eastern United States, we began to see confederations pop up during the 12 and 1300s. And I'll tell you what, folks, when you look at this form of government, it is incredibly successful. Not only at keeping at expanding where people are living and expanding the number of products that they have access to, it is also really, really important in keeping the peace. Native American civilization did really well with this. Up in this area, we have a bunch of confederations that are around. Just pointing out a couple of them. Right up here, you'll notice the Abenaki, right? This is one of the tribes in the area. And this area was home to the Wabanaki Confederation. Down here, you had the Wyandot, or the Huron Confederation. Right down here, you have the Haudenosaunee, or the Iroquois Confederation, which I'll talk about at greater length in just a couple of minutes. But then you also have down here the Powhatan Confederation. You have a lot of them here also in southeastern New England through Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut. You also have a couple of confederations that are just beginning. And what's going to happen here is that these confederations are really going to be very effective forms of government. Just so you understand this, folks, the confederations that you see here are going to be expanding pretty much constantly until the 1500s. And what happens in the 1500s, of course, is that by then, when Europeans come in, we're going to have a very different situation. And not because of conquest, mainly because of disease. I'll talk about that in a minute as well. Now, when you look at an area like Connecticut, for instance, we think of Connecticut as a fairly small state. But did you guys ever get into I don't mean to get too deep into politics, folks, but do you guys remember when Ned Lamont was elected governor and everyone started talking about tolls? And why? Because people just pass right through Connecticut, right? They don't even stop, right? Native American civilization would have said the same thing. If you look at a map of Connecticut during Native American times, this is what you would see. The red lines are actually the major trails that go through this area, all right? Now, what you're looking at here, if you look at this map very carefully, you'll notice they really actually are the first people who made the highways that you and I drive on today. If you look here at, right, for instance, you look at Route 7, right, going up along the coast, which goes right up along the Housatonic, just like 7 does. Route 8, Route 91, right? And I also like this one, because I grew up in Vernon, right? And this one, right, which is basically Route 84 coming down here. All of these routes are literally a couple of thousand years old. And so Native Americans would go up and down this area, would trade. They would use a lot of the waterways to be able to move fairly quickly. But what we would find is that by the 1300s, all of these confederations, all of the business that they're doing is really beginning to be quite profitable. And this is important because when the colonists come from England and start setting stuff up, they're going to see that profitability and they're going to see possibilities there. And make no mistake, the Native Americans saw it the same way. They looked at the English coming in. And I will tell you, folks, if you want to know what stopped Native American civilization in its tracks, is generally two things. One was the musket. As soon as a Native American saw a musket, they were like, I can kill something at 100 yards with good accuracy with a tiny ball. I don't have to create my own arrows. By 1700, Native Americans weren't using the bow and arrow anymore. The other thing was the teapot. If you were in the Northeast and you wanted to make something like a tisane, that is, use herbs and make a hot drink out of it, you use birch bark to do it. Now, birch bark is great. If you fill it with water, you put it in the middle of a fire, it doesn't catch on fire. The water will literally keep the temperature too low in it. But you guys ever boil water in a saucepan and then go off and do something else? And then about a half hour later, you kind of, what's that terrible smell? That's the metal of the saucepan now burning on your oven, right? Well, if you let it go into a boil and it starts to boil down, of course, birch bark immediately will ignite. As soon as you got a teapot that whistled when the water began to boil, I will tell you very seriously, this was something that Native American women immediately began to take advantage of. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a few minutes as well. But the big product that's coming out of this area is actually one that doesn't come from Connecticut or Rhode Island, but does come from down in this area. And that product is a certain kind of whelk. This is a certain kind of shell that makes up what we call wampum. Now, I'm sure you've all heard the name wampum before. And for many people, they kind of translate this very roughly as this is Native American money. It's really not the case. It does have value to it, but wampum is also used because it is so valuable to Native Americans as kind of a symbol of allegiance, you might say. So if you're talking to a Native American tribe and you want to establish a treaty with them, more than likely what you're going to get is something that looks like this. This is a wampum belt. And it does have a great deal of monetary value if you're going to be buying something, you could use wampum for it. But it also implies something else, something more important. And that is the idea that now we're kind of bound. We're bound by commercial or family or totemic ties. And this is something very important. A misunderstanding on wampum is actually going to be one of the major causes of the Pequot War. And again, I'll mention that in a few minutes. Just wanted to show you a little bit. This is actually one of the most famous of the wampum belts. This is the wampum belt for the Haudenosaunee, which is the Iroquois Confederation. And the Iroquois Confederation is probably the most powerful of all the confederations in the eastern United States. Now, where do you get this wampum? This is a great thing, folks. There's only one place to get it, and that is the tip of Long Island. And right on the tip of Long Island, you do have a tribe. They're fairly small. They're called the Montaukes. And if you've ever been on Long Island, you probably recognize the name. Now, what this means is whoever's down in this area and is the most powerful tribe or confederation is going to control those wampum fields. And if they can do that, it's like controlling a gold mine in a sense. You really have a lot of wealth that's coming out of the ground. You control a lot of the commercial activities of people that are going to be in the area. And this wampum is going to go all over the East Coast, right out into the Midwest. So this is a product that is highly sought after all over the place. Now, into this story is going to come a couple of tribes. You guys notice that right up here we see the Pequot and the Mohegan, right? And this is really something that we see as kind of natural to this area. As a matter of fact, these tribes were not natural to that area until about the 1500s. And the reason for this is the success of one of the greatest confederations of Native Americans, and that's right here. You've probably all heard the name Iroquois. Yes, for a lot of people, Iroquois is a very common name. Most people believe that Iroquois is actually a tribal name, but it is not. It's actually a name that you would apply to people who belong to this Iroquois Confederation or the Iroquois Longhouse, which is called the Haudenosaunee. This was a fantastic group of people, and according to Ben Franklin, also the inspiration for the American federal system of government. In that, if you were going to join the Iroquois Confederation, you could be Oñata, for instance, in this tribe, you would retain that status. I am Oñata, but when I go into the Iroquois Confederation, I am also Iroquois. And so when you think about being in Connecticut, you're citizens of Connecticut. I imagine most of you anyway, probably have your driver's license from here, registered to vote. But we are also citizens of the United States. To Benjamin Franklin, this is what he said was the inspiration behind the federal system of government. Folks, whenever Benjamin Franklin tells you something, throw a little salt over the shoulder. You're never quite sure. He loved a good story. But here's the thing about this. The Iroquois Confederation was an incredibly successful, efficient form of government. If you want to see something, for myself, I'm always impressed by this. In the Iroquois Confederation, only men were the speakers. So only men were representatives in the Iroquois Confederation. However, only women elected the men who would go and speak in the Iroquois Confederation. In addition, and you like this, folks, you would not recognize this form of government if you were in Washington, D.C. or in Hartford, right? But the other thing is, when the Iroquois Confederation met in full session, the men would be on one side, women could attend on the other. Now, the women couldn't speak, but the men could. And when the men spoke, they had to speak looking at the women, all right? And so, if you think about it this way, if you're in Washington or Hartford, we have ideologies, right? Well, I'm conservative, I'm liberal, and then you'll speak along those ideological lines. We have a platform. This is what we want to do, right? Native Americans didn't want that. In the Iroquois Confederation, what they wanted was unanimity. So that when they would be speaking, if I was speaking up here and I'm looking at all the women of the tribes and I said, you know, we've got to go to war against these Tuscarora people. If I'm looking and the women are all kind of like, yeah, that's right, we're going to go. And then I get all bloody-minded, right? This is great. But if I'm talking and all of these women are looking at me, like I'm going to go home and get about a foot off the top of my body cut off, immediately, I might be speaking, you know, we want war, and then kind of, but isn't peace to be preferred, right? And then the whole room, yes, thank you, right? They wanted unanimity, and that's what they strove for. What you found was that in doing so, basically all of these people got a great deal of voice in what Native Americans were doing. This form of government was so successful that other tribes began to kind of join up with them, and these guys began to expand a lot. When the Mohawks began to expand down into the southeast, and here you're talking about upstate New York, western Massachusetts, there were two tribes that they basically kicked out of that area. They're known as the Pequots and Mohegans. So in the 1500s, these tribes really don't know what to do because these guys are pushing them out, but where are they going to go? They're fairly small tribes, but what they realize is that down in this area, all of these tribes are even smaller than them. And so, in order not to be a little fish in a big pond, the Pequots and Mohegans will migrate down into that area, and then they will find themselves in the driver's seat for that wampum trade. And here's what you have, right? The Pequots and Mohegans, you notice where they are. It's right across here from Long Island. It's a pretty easy canoe shop right over Long Island Sound. And the Pequots are actually a very powerful tribe. Now, what they would do is they kind of begin to expand out in this area. And as they begin to expand outwards, keep in mind, by the 1500s, these guys are very powerful. They can be very violent, right? And they're running essentially a protection racket in this whole area. So the Pequots would come to town and they would tell you, listen, we're going out on a raid. And there'd be 300 warriors, all painted for war. And they would say, hey, you wouldn't mind giving us a couple of gifts, like food and supplies to see us on our way. Well, yeah, I mean, you got 300 warriors with you. I'll give you whatever you want, right? And so they would accept these. After a while, they would begin to intermarry with people around them, and thus the protection scheme kind of goes outward into what will become a confederation, or what would become a confederation. Because what we're going to find is that now things are going to change, and they're going to change very, very quickly, folks. In 1620-21, that is that winter, probably aware, the Pilgrims are going to come up to an area. At first, they try to land in Provincetown, very hostile tribes down there. So instead, what they're going to do is they're going to go to Plymouth, and they're going to set up shop there, basically. Now, when they do this, a couple of things are going to happen. First of all, when they begin to move in, one tribe or one group of tribes known as the Wampanoags will actually be friendly to them. And they're going to send a few people down, kind of tell people what kind of agriculture is in the area and how to grow things. Have you ever heard of Squanto, right? The friendly Indian, right? He goes in, tells the Pilgrims how to lay down fertilizer. And, you know, the fact of the matter is, at this point in their first winter, half of the 150 people who had settled there actually died. So it's not an easy way to go. And folks, all you have to do is look outside right now. I mean, I would not want to be here with no food and hardly any shelter in this kind of weather. So you can imagine, right? But what they also are going to find is that they will bring with them disease. Now, when I say disease, folks, we think about disease in Western civilization, right? And we think about things like the Black Plague, right? The bubonic plague. It's terrible. Killed 25 to 33% of Europe in the 1400s. That's a lot of people, folks. But the diseases that the Westerners brought with them to the New World succeeded in wiping out, and I shouldn't say succeeded in, but I hope you take my meaning correctly. But basically, they wiped out 80 to 99% of all of the Native Americans that were in the United States. Disease simply wiped people out. 1617 to 19, down along the coast of Connecticut, and let me see if I can go up. Right along here from the southern coast, right down through Connecticut to New York, hepatitis B and smallpox came in and basically wiped out about 95% of the people that were living along the coast. The people who were not so badly affected were actually the Pequots and Mohegans, because they didn't live right on the coast. They lived a few miles inland, around the towns of Ledyard, Stonington, North Stonington. And so what happens is they kind of escape from that a little bit, so they retain their numbers. About 1619, you had about 8,000 Pequots and Mohegans living down in that area. Then in 1633, 34, smallpox will hit again. 50% of the Pequots and Mohegans will then die from that in those 2 years. So that by the time of the Pequot War, there are about 3,000 Pequots left. So a lot of them have really been kind of wiped out already. And this is going to be a pattern we see repeated all over the United States. In fact, I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but they just made a huge discovery of massive cities in the Amazon. Did anyone hear about this? This just last week. What they're saying now is that there were probably a couple 100,000 people living in the Amazon basin. And this Spanish explorer went up the Amazon. His name was Francisco de Orellana. And as he's going up the Amazon, he said, I see like literally thousands of people living everywhere. And you think to yourself, this is the Amazon basin. Like, there's no human life out there except for a few, tribes, indigenous tribes that are still in the rainforest. Now they're discovering huge city sites. And what they believe is that Orellana brought with him, right, typhus, diphtheria, smallpox, right, measles, anything that you can think of that would be inconvenient for us would be deadly to Native Americans. They had no such diseases in their civilizations. And so what would happen is when smallpox hits a village, it would come in, and usually, smallpox will take a while, right? If it came into this room, it would take a while for it to percolate and kind of get up and affect us physically. Native American villages, within 24 hours, almost everyone's dead. And so you might have one or two kids who lived, and they wouldn't know what to do. So what would they do? They'd go to the next village, because at least there's people there that they know. And of course, they would bring the disease with them. And this was really horrible and tragic, but folks, 80 to 99%. And what this means is virtually all of Native American civilization was wiped out by these diseases. We don't know their languages. We don't know their ceremonies. We don't know anything about them, right? And so what we find is that when the English come in, right, they're going to bring with them their own way of life. They're going to bring with them a great deal of interest in making profits off of the very profitable wampum and fur trade going on in the area, right? But the English won't be the only people coming in. And so what we're going to have here is a very complex situation. The first people who actually settle in Connecticut will not be the English, or the first Europeans, I should say. They won't be the English. They'll actually be the Dutch. And the Dutch, first in 1619, will go up to an area that we now know as Hartford, Connecticut, and that is an area that used to be called Adrian's Landing. That was long ago. And they're going to set up there the Point Hope trading post. Now, the Dutch are going to do this because what they want really is furs. They're not in large numbers. They don't really want to settle there too much. But what they do want to do is trade, because those furs, especially beaver, is becoming very, very popular back in Europe. If you're familiar with beaver, folks, you can make hats out of it. You ever see the hats, the old top hat people used to wear? There's two kinds. You can get a beaver or you can get a rabbit. If you have a beaver hat, you can always tell, because when it rains, the beaver hat retains its shape. If you have a rabbit one, which is a knockoff version, right, then it rains, it looks like a beret has just collapsed on your head. And so if you wanted to be a well-to-do young man, you wanted to make sure you had beaver hats here. Just so you understand, folks, it sounds almost ludicrous what I'm telling you, but some 25 million beaver were taken out of New England between 1630 and 1775. Basically wiped out the entire species until only a few years ago. Now the beaver are back, right? Building their dams, flooding basements everywhere. You gotta love the beaver, it's fantastic. Worked real hard. But at any rate, what happens here is that the English begin to come in and actually have conflicts with the Dutch in this area. So they're both trying to take over the trade in that area. Now at the same time, the Pequots and Mohegans, who are in control of the wampum trade, don't want anyone else trading with the Dutch or English because they want all the profits from it. And so you've also got Native American conflicts between the Mohegan Pequots, mainly with the Narragansetts and Wampanoags. And so these folks are fighting, the Europeans are fighting, the Europeans will then be fighting with the Native Americans as well. So it's a very complex situation here. But one of the things that's universal among the Europeans is the idea of land ownership. It's very different from the idea of land ownership in the Native American sense. Very often you'll hear Native Americans didn't understand what real estate was. It's a ludicrous, ridiculous thing to say. If you're thinking about buying a house, folks, you guys, I'm sure if you're, for instance, on a well, you're thinking about water first. Native Americans are really no different from that. They had traditional areas that they would actually patrol in. And I remember a few of these. Up in this area, you might have some podunks walking around. You might have some suckyogs walking around, Tunsis, right? But they were very careful about where they went, because you cross the wrong stream, you're going to be now in enemy territory. And Native Americans really lived in a situation that you and I would probably call highly racist. They did not like their neighbors for the most part, and this is one of the things that will give the English and the Dutch the way to get into this and kind of divide and conquer. And this is what they're going to use as they go through colonial history. Now here, again, right, as we come in, we're seeing this kind of conflict. And the English, basically what they say, and this is a Massachusetts Bay Colony pamphlet. It was distributed in England in order to attract people over to New England. And that is, the Indians are not able to make use of 1/4 part of the land. Neither have they any settled places as towns to dwell in, but change their habitation from place to place. Well, that's true, but if you were here, for instance, in this site, and we found a Native American tribe here, it is true, they would move around, but this was very carefully orchestrated movement. They would be back here next year doing the same things in the same places. The reason? Simple. Once you hunt and fish out an area, you don't want to keep doing that because you won't have any food. And so they would move down the road and then begin to do the same thing down there. They generally moved in cyclical fashion through their traditional lands. Now, what's going to happen here at the same time is that beginning in 1630, lots of English people are going to start coming over. They call this the Great Migration. And so all kinds of people who are kind of Puritans, that is, like the Pilgrims, are going to start coming into this area. When they do, the people who are Pilgrims up in Plymouth and then later on the Massachusetts Bay Colony, a lot of these people are not going to be very attractive to the Puritans that are up there. And some of them you may have heard of. You ever hear the name Anne Hutchinson? Right? Or if you've ever heard the Hutchinson Parkway, right, down in New York, right? People like this who have very independent ideas of religion are not very popular with the town fathers in places like Plymouth. And so they begin to kind of get exiled, a lot of them. One of them who does, and I wanted to mention just very quickly, I always thought this is a great story, is a guy in 1631. He is a Baptist, which if you're in Puritan areas, a Baptist, you might as well be, an alien who seeks to take over Earth, because they're going to wipe you out. And one night, as he's walking back to his house in 1631, guy comes up to him and says, hey, there's a bunch of really sketchy looking guys waiting at your house. In fact, what it turns out is that the town fathers in Plymouth had actually hired hitmen to kill Roger Williams. And so Roger Williams goes back and basically says, my God, it's really lucky I got warned about this. And he flees. And he goes down into an area where it's right on Narragansett Bay. And he says, it was the luck of God, right, that got me out here, that just made me randomly see these guys. And so he names the area that he lives in Providence. And he's going to be the guy who founds Rhode Island during this time. Another thing about Roger Williams is he's very friendly to the Narragansetts. He speaks fluent Narragansett. He's the first person who makes a 2-language dictionary. You guys ever seen his English-Spanish dictionary? He makes an English Narragansett dictionary. I'm not sure how much it's sold on Amazon at this point, but you can probably still find it. However, there are a lot of these people kind of splintery. They don't want them there. One of the people who is like this, he is a Protestant, also Calvinist, but not very popular with the town fathers is this man, Thomas Hooker. Now Hooker, in 1634, 1635, begins to talk to people about kind of getting out of Massachusetts. And what he's going to do is actually lead a group of people. I want to show you kind of the same map we saw before. But he'll lead them out of this area and then go right down what is called the Connecticut Trail. That's what really Route 84 is today. And he will settle right where 84, or the Connecticut Trail, will cross the Connecticut River. Folks, is there anyone here from Wethersfield? No? Anyone from Windsor? Okay, you're from Windsor?
I'm not, but my 1635 ancestor.
Oh, they were from Windsor? Okay. In that case, folks, I will say Windsor was certainly the first settlement they made in Connecticut. If there was somebody from Wethersfield here, they would tell you that Wethersfield was the first. In order to, kind of not have any kind of incidents occur, we'll just say it was one of the two of them, right? Yeah, and they both were settled about the same time. But again, they settled exactly where the Dutch had been and to do the same thing. Now, here's what happens, though, during this time. Immediately, conflict is going to begin. First of all, coming into the Dutch trading post, just before Hooker brings people down into Connecticut, some Narragansetts wanted to trade with them. And the Pequots decided they weren't going to allow it. So the Narragansetts had sent 3 men to go over to the Point Hope trading post and begin to initiate commercial relations. The Pequots murdered them. And when they did, all right, they basically were saying, this is our purview, this is not yours. Now, in retaliation for that, the Dutch will then take the sachem or chief of the Pequots hostage. And they'll say, we want a bunch of furs for this guy, you better pay a good ransom. The Native Americans in the area immediately are struck by this, like their chief has been just kidnapped. Imagine having the governor or the president kidnapped, right? What would we do about this, right? And so what they do is they send the most valuable product they have. They send about literally 200 yards of wampum belts to the Dutch, right? The Dutch, looking at these things, are like, so they sent us a bunch of beads? This is stupid. They kill the guy, his name is Tatabem, right? And so they just execute him right off, and the Pequots are furious. Tatabem's son, his name is Sassacus, is going to take over control of the Pequots. Now, just as a side note, folks, and you can see how complex this is all getting. Everyone is fighting everybody, got arguments with everybody. At the same time that Sassacus takes over the Pequots, there's another guy who wants to be the sachem for the Pequots. His name is Uncas. And Uncas will attempt to take over the tribe. And I don't know about you, I don't give Sassacus too much credit for brains, because Uncas tried to do this 5 times, and each time was forgiven by Sassacus and then allowed to kind of go on with his life. It's kind of a strange thing when you try to take over a government 5 different times and people just say, well, I guess it's okay. In the end, Uncas wouldn't do too well out of all of this anyway. However, it is really important to know that at this point, the Native Americans are beginning to look at the Europeans as somebody that really we should kind of get rid of. In 1634, the Native Americans will find a man who is in a ship. He's a captain of it. His name is John Stone. And folks, I'm going to warn you, if you thought it was confusing before, virtually everyone I talk about now is named John. So have fun with this too, right? Now, John Stone is known by everyone as a pirate, a drunkard, a rapist, and a murderer. No kidding, right? And so basically, they get this guy, they come aboard the ship, they get Stone drunk, and the Pequots murder him and a lot of his crew. And what happens is the English are actually really happy about this. Nobody liked John Stone. He was very much a lowlife, right? But it also gives people the chance now to come down on the Pequots because of this. And so the English begin to say to the Pequots, we want to know exactly who killed them, and we want you to deliver them up to us for judgment. And the Pequots, I love their defense. Their defense when they said, why'd you kill this guy, John Stone, if the Dutch were the ones that killed Tatabem? They said, well, we didn't know. you Europeans all look the same to us. But basically what happens is, after this, the tensions are running really high. In 1636, a very kind of popular trader that is a merchant, but not very popular in Massachusetts, a man named John Oldham, who actually showed Hooker the Connecticut Trail that he took into the state, is also murdered by some Native Americans. And we don't know who did it. Could be some Massachusetts, could be West Niantic, but no one really knows. However, John Winthrop, the governor of Massachusetts at the time, sees an opportunity here to take over the wampum trade and basically get into control here. And he sends this man, John Endicott, to actually go down onto Block Island, where they believe the murderers are, and to exact extradition, basically, to take these guys back to Massachusetts for judgment. Now, when he goes down, what happens is they will actually land on Block Island. The Native Americans are actually going to defend themselves against this. But for the most part, the English, who are very well armored, very well armed, are not really going to be harmed by this. Endicott can't find the murderers, but against John Winthrop's express orders, he begins burning villages all over Block Island, which immediately is going to make the Native Americans very angry. They're going to want to get rid of now the English who are there. And so they begin to raid, especially the Pequots, begin to raid English settlements all over Connecticut, Rhode Island, and Massachusetts. So finally what's going to happen is that on May 1st, 1637, Connecticut and Massachusetts will decide that they're going to get armies together and they're going to wipe out the Pequots. Now, the way they do this is that they're going to get together, and actually this is the first day of May, General Court at Hartford, and this is what they're going to do. They're going to actually get this many people out of each town, right? They're going to talk about how to order them, what the hierarchy is, how much they're to be supplied. And at this time, the Pequots are telling other tribes in the area, especially the Narragansetts and Wampanoags, with whom they do not have good relations. They said, they're coming after us now. It's not going to be long before they come after you as well. The Narragansetts are almost ready to sign a treaty with them, and Roger Williams intercedes. And he says, you don't want to do that. Side with the English, because these Pequots are imperialists. You want to get rid of them. And finally, the Narragansetts will actually side with the English against the Pequot Indians. And so, basically what's going to happen is, in late May 1637, and this is where the Pequot War really begins, two people. One is John Mason, and the other one is John Underhill. Both of them experienced soldiers of fortune, both of them with experience in leading armies. They are going to actually get together, and Mason is going to be the commander of Connecticut troops. Underhill will be the commander of Massachusetts troops. It is Underhill who really gives us the biggest account that we know of the Pequot Wars. This is his book, and it was actually published a year after the war in 1638. But what's going to happen is they're going to get together, and that's what their mission is going to be. We're going to wipe out the Pequot tribe. Before they go, Thomas Hooker actually gives a rousing sermon in Hartford. And if you want to see the colonial attitude toward Native Americans, folks, it's right here. In May 1637, he says, execute those whom God, the righteous judge of all the world, hath condemned for blaspheming his sacred majesty and murdering his servants. Execute vengeance on the heathen. Bind their kings in chains and nobles in fetters of iron. Make their multitudes fall under your warlike weapons. Your feet shall be set on their proud necks. Sounds great, right? And what they're going to do is they're going to get together. There's about 90 colonists and about 260 Narragansetts, and they're going to get together to actually execute this war. In late May, and here, folks, just so you know this, if you're reading about the Pequot Wars, you're going to read two dates, May 26th and June 5th. And the reason you read the two of them is because it depends on which calendar you're using. Right around that time was when we changed to the modern calendar and kind of gained 2 weeks right about then. And so what happens is you'll see both of those dates. But as the people are going to come down the Connecticut River, right, and they're going to start going along the coast, they're being tracked by the Pequots. They can see it up the whole way through. And so rather than going up the Mystic River, which is what they wanted to do, what the colonists will do instead is go into Narragansett land, pick up their allies, and then go overland toward the Pequot village. And at this point, folks, there's really only one main place that the Pequots are. And this is pretty much what it looks like. It's a surprisingly accurate portrayal. This is the settlement itself, and the natives and the colonists are going to be outside of it. And what you're going to find is they launch their attack, and again, May 26th, June 5th. When they launch the attack, and in fact, you're going to see a picture of the settlement a little bit more kind of realistic soon. They can't get inside. The place is stockaded with a fence around it. And as they try to get in, what you find is you see these entrances up here. The entrances aren't quite like this. They're not open entrances. They will overlap their walls so that in order to get into the settlement, you got to go in single file. And if that's the case, all you need is a couple of guys with bow and arrow or guns, and they can defend that area. The English take 50% casualties as they're standing outside these walls, and they can't really get in at all. The natives are defending it very vociferously. This is men, women, and children in here, so you can imagine they're defending everything, not only their homes, but their very lives. And so Mason comes up with an idea. After a while, he realizes they're not going to get in, and Mason says, we should never kill them after that manner. That is, with swords, we must burn them. And what's going to happen is they begin to literally set the torch. I wanted to show you, this is what the settlement would actually look like. And they just torch the entire place. They burn it to the ground. They kill about 600 men, women, and children inside. And when they do, this is pretty much the end of the Pequot tribe as we know it at this time. The end of their position of power. Now, at this time, right, the Narragansetts are standing outside of here, and the Narragansetts are screaming bloody murder because they said the last thing you want to do is kill all these women and children. They said what we want to do is we want to take the women and children and make them into Narragansetts. That's a lot easier to do than just wiping them all out. The English will not be dissuaded. And so basically everyone in this area is completely killed. Sassacus, who is the sachem, takes about 300 warriors and begins to flee along the coast and go west. Now, this will be important in just a second, but actually what they say is Underhill wrote, many courageous fellows were unwilling to come out and fought most desperately through the palisados, so as they were scorched and burnt with the very flame and were deprived of their arms. The fire burnt their very bowstrings, right? So basically, after this battle, there's no more Pequot power left. And as Sassacus and his 300 men begin to go into the western part of Connecticut, the colonists are basically going to shadow them right along the coast. Now, folks, if you ever look at settlements along the coast in Connecticut, look at when they were formed, you will notice that a few of them, New Haven, which was originally called Quinnipiac, Milford, Bridgeport, Fairfield, all of the original settlements were always in 1639, 1640. And the reason is because as they were shadowing the natives along the coast, the colonists were also siting out the prime areas for harborage. And basically what you'll find is that places like New Haven, which is one of the great deep water ports of the East Coast until the 1700s, places like Milford, places like Fairfield, these are places that are going to be settled directly as a result of the Pequot War. Now, what's going to happen is that in July of 1637, the Pequots are going to be in Fairfield, and it's called the Pequot Swamp today. No one really knows where the battle was, or if they do, they're not revealing it so that they can prevent all the kinds of people with metal detectors from going out and just digging up the whole area. But basically, there's a fort out here. The colonists will attack it, and they will wipe out all but a few of Sassacus's followers and Sassacus. Sassacus will lead the men right up into upstate New York, because what he's hoping is that he can kind of melt away into the Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois Confederacy. But the Mohawks find him, and basically they send his head back to the English and say, you know, I hope you approve of what we've done. And basically, that's the end of the Pequot War. Now, Underhill wrote about this. Sometimes the scripture declareth women and children must perish with their parents. Sometimes the case alters, but we will not dispute it now. We had sufficient light from the word of God for our proceedings. Essentially, what the colonists felt was that they were wiping out people who were essentially anti-Christian. But please.
Yes, and one of, I can't remember which governor said that it was a sweet-smelling sacrifice unto God.
Right. Yeah, actually, that was Mason who said, I've got that quote in here, actually. You'll see that in a little while. Yeah, these guys really were quite certain that they were in the right about this. It doesn't surprise you. When you look at people who are Calvinists, you know, Calvinists would say, geez, there's only going to be about 10,000 people saved in the world. Of course, I'm one. I don't know about you jokers, but I'm going to be okay. So it tends to be, they were pretty confident about themselves. But at any rate, what's going to happen is that after the Pequot Wars, now you're going to have a very different setting here. Pequots and Mohegans are basically wiped out. And in 1638, what's going to happen is the Treaty of Hartford will be signed. And in the Treaty of Hartford, the Pequot tribe is extinguished. The name Pequot is not allowed to be spoken by Native Americans. And the remaining Pequots that they caught were all sold into slavery in Barbados and Bermuda. So basically, they wiped out the tribe. Now, what's going to happen is within a few years, back in this area, there will be a few people who are Pequot. They kind of move back in kind of slowly. But they're along an area that gives them the name Mashantucket Pequots. And that's what the difference is. Mashantucket Pequots are basically people who came in after the Treaty of Hartford in 1638 and kind of reoccupied the area. But even then, folks, when I was a child, I remember very well that Uncasville, right, which was where the original reservation was, that was 1.25 acres. That was the original reservation. Of course, now it's much bigger. They won that also through a court case, which is quite scary, frankly. When you start bringing people to court for having violated a treaty against Native Americans, Americans get a little bit uneasy about that. You guys remember Ben and Jerry's last year? Yeah. Do you remember what Ben and Jerry's came out with this tweet, right? I don't know if do you call them X's now? I don't know. Anyway, so they came out with this tweet. It said, much of America is based on Native American land. We should give this back to people. Well, they shouldn't have said that, because immediately the Abenaki chief in the area said, yes, you're right. Your international headquarters is on sacred ground for the Abenaki. That was the end of that Twitter stream. They weren't going to talk after that. This is very dangerous for people, right? Now, what the English wanted out of this, they got, which is they got control not only of the Pequots, but also they subjected all of these tribes, right, and especially Narragansetts and Wampanoags, to English law. That from now on, when any tribe has a problem with another tribe, the English will be the arbitrators of that case, of that grievance. And this is something that a lot of people don't like too much. And the Narragansetts, the loyal companions and allies of the English, immediately after the war say, well, we'd like exclusive rights to trading with you guys. And the English say, no, we're not going to give them to you. And immediately the Narragansetts begin to get a lot of resentment about this. Now, what this is going to do is lead to a growing amount of tension here among the Wampanoags. Now, the Wampanoags are going to be led by a man named Massasoit, who is also a fairly famous Native American name from that area. He was the chief of the Wampanoags when the Pilgrims came. In 1661, Massasoit passes on, and he gives the sacramship to his son. His son's name is Wamasuda. Very friendly with the colonists, but he visits Plymouth one day. No one knows what happened, and it's very possible that he got food poisoning out of it. But he came out of the visit basically on his deathbed. And in 1662, only a year after his sacramship, he was actually, he died. Now, when he died, nobody knows what exactly killed him, because he was pretty friendly to the English there. But his brother, who was a man named Metacom, or as we call him, King Philip, actually believed that the colonists had poisoned his brother. And in 1662, he takes over sacramship of the Wampanoags. Immediately, right? And this is Wamasuda, right? And he's coming into Plymouth, where he will, meet his end. And then Metacom will come out. Now, what Metacom does, which is very frightening to the colonists, is very simple. Up until now, if you were Wampanoag and you wanted to fight against the English, you might be able to find an ally or two, but most of the people around you are enemies. Metacom is very different. He begins to visit different tribes and say, these people are going to kill us all. We better band together and then, put these people, let's just push them right back into the ocean, right? This is something that the English do not like. Having a couple hundred tribes in the area is all right. You can divide and conquer. Having them all united against you means you may very well lose that war. And what they're going to begin to do now is fight in a very different way. When Native Americans fought, generally they did not fight to wipe people out. The traditional areas they were in were enough for them. That's where they lived, that's where they would continue to live. When they fought, it was generally for gene pool. That is, you would go out and you would try to kidnap a bunch of women and children. You bring them back to the tribe so that you can expand your gene pool. Now, folks, when you think about this, just as a side note, we think about this as really, that's a very pretty cruel thing. Have you ever heard of colonists being kidnapped by Native Americans? No? Abraham Lincoln's father was almost kidnapped by the Native Americans. They killed his grandfather, tried to take him, right? But what they don't tell you is, if you didn't go out and get these people within 2 days or so, they weren't coming back. They didn't like coming back. If you went out and, for instance, if a woman was kidnapped, brought to a tribe, right? She was immediately married off to a guy in the tribe. You guys understand? As soon as she's married off to a man in the tribe, she enjoys full rights. And keep in mind, Native American women had a lot more rights than colonial women did. If you were a colonial woman, you kept your house. You also worked 14 hours a day in the fields. The children were also your responsibility. And one thing they don't tell you is that things like drunkenness and spousal abuse were rife in the colonies. It's a hard life, right? And so you kidnap somebody, and after about 3 days, she realizes, oh my God, all I have to do is get pregnant, and I'm gonna have a much better life than I ever had back then. With kids, if you didn't get them in 24 hours, Native American, if you wanna know one difference, Native Americans never hit their children. All right, they would go out into tribes and in fact say, don't keep me here in Massachusetts because they're gonna come for me, send me out to upstate New York. Within a week, these guys are down in Pennsylvania, right? They would do anything to stay with the tribes. So it is actually an interesting system when you think about this idea of people kidnapping others. But here, as I said, now, Metacom, he's starting to go around and unite all of these tribes. And what happens is 3 Wampanoags, right, are going to actually commit murder. Now, when they do, and this is in 1675, they are going to commit murder. The Wampanoags themselves will judge them. And this is usually something that's pretty traditional. The English will take the 3 men and they will execute them without consulting with the Wampanoags. And this is the last straw for Philip or Metacomet, however you want to call him. And he will begin a series of raids up and down the area between Rhode Island and basically western Massachusetts. All over the place, they simply begin to come out of the woods and just raid places. And very different warfare. Before, you were fighting for basically women and children, your gene pool. Not anymore. You are now fighting to terrorize. So when you go into an area now, you will kill the women and children. You'll burn everything. You will cut people into pieces. And this is something you do to make sure that people are just going to run away. This is something that the Native Americans will also employ in the 19th century out into the West. But the fact is, by now, there are just too many people in this area to really be able to drive them all out. Between 1675 and 1676, a lot of the towns, wherever you see a little yellow dot here, these towns are actually burned to the ground by Native Americans. Only one of them occurs in Simsbury. There are raids up and down the Connecticut River, but basically, this is a fairly peaceful area. But what happens is that in the spring of 1676, down in Rhode Island, and Mount Hope is where actually King Philip or Metacom is based. What's going to happen is that they will take his wife and children, and the colonists will, and kidnap them. They hold them for ransom. And then King Philip he doesn't really know what to do. He's between kind of a rock and a hard place. But then what happens is that in August of 1676, another Native American from a neighboring tribe actually assassinates him as he's going to a meeting with the English colonists. Basically, that's the end of King Philip's War. Once his leadership is out of the way, which was a very unifying leadership, we won't see this kind of war again until the 1700s, when a man named Pontiac will lead a rebellion in 1762 and 63. But the fact of the matter is, for a little while, they struck absolute fear into the colonies, right? And this is the burning of Deerfield, but again, Simsbury is also burned. But all of these raids essentially are going to stop beginning in July of 1676. What's going to happen is that they will catch King Philip at that point, or Metacom at that point. Now, I just wanted to show you this one quote. If you want to know exactly what the natives are doing at this time, right? The English account of doing this, 1676, said, they took 5 or 6 of the English and carried them away alive. but that night killed them in such a manner as none but savages would have done. For they stripped them naked and caused them to run the gauntlet, whipping them after a cruel and bloody manner. Now, folks, when you talk about running a gauntlet, I'm sure you know what that means, right? You're going to be running between lines of people. When they strip them, it is a little different because what they generally will do is they'll either cut you very shallowly, right, so that you're bleeding, but then they begin to throw things like boiling water on you, and boiling water on a cut like that's rather uncomfortable, or hot ashes, right? So when you start getting this, it is not only painful, it really is cruel. Whipping them after a cruel and bloody manner, threw hot ashes upon them, cut out the flesh of their legs, and put fire into their wounds, delighting to see the miserable torments of wretched creatures. Thus they are the perfect children of the devil, right? And so what happens is the English colonists are finally going to come out in Rhode Island in 1676. They're going to take the last Wampanoag strong point, and then under the guise of meeting with the colonists, King Philip himself will be killed. Now, when he's killed, all right, it's kind of interesting to see this. When he's killed, his body is dismembered. I mean, his head is put on the end of a pike and actually displayed on the gates of Plymouth for about 20 years. Literally 20, right? 2 decades, right? His hands, his right hand was given to the man who assassinated him. Parts of his bodies are sent all over the colonies. So just like, I know it sounds weird to say, but remember after 9/11 that a lot of fire departments would get small pieces of the World Trade Center as kind of a memorial. In a sense, they do the same thing. To the colonies, they'll send out pieces of Philip, right? And basically they can feel now they've really destroyed everybody. At the same time, King Philip's War, statistically the bloodiest war in American history. About 1/3 of the people involved in it, the colonists on that side, died. But if you look at this table, it's kind of interesting, right? This is the percentage or the population of European colonists. And you'll notice after 1640, 1680 is right here. Look at the number go up, right? It just goes up incredibly fast. But if you look at this green line, the green line is Native American populations. And the Native American population essentially ceases to be when you're in the late 1600s. So that by the 1700s, what you find is that there are really virtually no Native Americans, and certainly no Native Americans living a traditional lifestyle in Connecticut. And in fact, one of the things you find is that by the 1800s, like 1830, 1840, Connecticut actually is so, quote unquote, civilized that they are one of the leaders of the anti-Native American persecution movement that was going on in the United States at the time. They haven't seen Native Americans in so long that they feel like they're friendly toward them now. And you can see that all over the place. The name of our state is, right, it's an Algonquian name, yeah. Land of the Long River. 26 states are named after Native Americans. I go down to North Haven every once in a while. I always laugh when I see Satcham Road, right? Like there's the name of the chief, but there's not much there. But you can see this all over the place. There is a great deal of interest in Native American civilizations. But when Native America and European civilization kind of got together, generally speaking, it did not go well. In fact, just as a last kind of quote, Captain John Mason said, "Let the whole earth be filled with his glory. Thus the Lord was pleased to smite our enemies in the hinder parts and give us their land for an inheritance." One of the last things I just wanted to say, folks, is when you look around Connecticut, if you ever see a town that ends in the word field, that's generally because they were based on Native American agricultural fields. So when you see a place like Danbury, which was called Swamp Field, essentially, that area was a big Native American village, right? But you always hear, Brimfield, Greenfield, Westfield, Eastfield. All of these are basically going to be based on the Native American civilization that had been in the area. But one thing is for sure, folks, as I close out my presentation, I would like to just say, it's interesting when we see this quote, "most furious in their rage and merciless where they overcome," one has to begin to ask whether this is a quote about Native Americans or about the colonists that basically took them over in the end. Well, folks, that's my presentation for today. I'd like to thank you very much for coming out. Thank you very much. Just wanted to give you a couple of announcements about the series of lectures, and then if you do have any questions or comments, I'd love to hear them right afterwards. Please go ahead.
Yes. Our next talk is February 17th by Todd Brida. He's going to talk about the Irish experience in the Civil War. And our own Lynn Kessler, right here, March 16th, is going to talk about World War II in the South Pacific. So mark your calendars, everybody. And Hamish, on behalf of the Soldiers Monument Commission, we'd like to present you with a hat.
Thank you. I would have paid money for one of those. It's funny, I walked out, and I will tell you folks, if you're going to buy any, the hats are great. It's a nice, solid hat. The t-shirts are only $10. So, you might want to go.
They're all small.
They're all small, but don't say that yet. Wait until they purchase it, and then, but, one other thing I wanted to say, folks, is if you are interested in the history of this area, I do want you to know that in the last couple of months, and many of you probably are already aware of this, there has been formed in Winstead a historic commission, which is really seeking to kind of further the interest of people who are interested in history and the history of Winchester and Winstead, and also see what we can do to further publicize the town and kind of heighten its profile in a lot of the ways. If you are interested in kind of a little more information on it, there's a guy here. I'm not going to say who it is. I'll just say his initials. His name is Lance Hansen, sitting right over here. But if you are interested in this, please do contact Mr. Hansen, because we could always use the people that are going to be interested in it. I'm figuring in this room, most of the people probably are a little bit interested in the history of the area. So thank you very much. But if anyone has any questions, I'd love to hear them.
Yeah, but you were referencing some historical events from 12 and 1300s.
Right.
And what is your reference for that? Was there writings or observations from that?
Actually, I understand. There's a couple of things. Mainly, it's stuff that wouldn't have come out until the 1950s and beyond. When you had the technology to actually look underneath the ground a little bit to see what was out there. There are a couple of indications we have of Native Americans having too much population. One is that you begin to have conflicts between Native Americans of a different nature. As I said, Native Americans tended to fight for gene pool, right? So they're looking for, they don't want to get inbred in essence. But then in the 1300s, for instance, the Cherokee begin to move outward and really start kind of conquering area. That's one of the indications we have that there are tensions with population in the area. That we hear about these wars that went on, even though no one from the West ever witnessed one. But you can also see other things. For instance, in many Cherokee fields and also up in New England, you begin to see towers erected, and just wooden towers, like you would have a fire tower, right? And people wondered about this. What exactly do you have this for? Why would you bother doing this? It's actually observation posts that you could look out for anyone trying to raid into the area. We also find that the creation of these confederations actually kind of furthers a lot of population growth. That what we can find, if we look under the ground right now, is we can find where people have died. We can find the old village sites, even though you're not going to go into them. I go up, are you familiar with People's State Forest?
Yeah.
Okay. So I hike up there a lot, and there's an area where there's a Barkhamsted lighthouse, if you're familiar with it. Up in that area, there was a whole Indian village as well. That we hear about them, but then the technology began to enable us to actually see them. Same thing that I mentioned about the Amazon. Suddenly you begin to see under the ground using radar, what they call LiDAR, right? That they'll go under, and you can see the cities as they were kind of originally designed. You see a lot more of this. And as I said, you do see a lot more movement as well. When you think about movement, this isn't really in New England, but if you've ever heard the name of these tribes, the Apache, the Comanche, the Navajo, all of those tribes are generally associated with the Southwest. But all of those tribes are actually from the Northwest. They wandered into that area, and then when the horses became available, that's when they really made the power out of it. The other group that I always like to point out is a group in Arizona, and they were known as the Aztecs. And in the 1200s, they were pushed out of that area, and they wandered into the area of Mexico City now, and Lake Texcoco, and they set up their civilization there. That kind of movement indicates that there was a lot of problems with population, So that's usually where we're going to get it from. But if you're thinking about documentation from Native Americans, almost impossible to get. Most of it is not only, some of it you can kind of count on. For instance, on Puerto Rico, people always said they were descended from the Taino. Until 30 years ago, any scientist in the country would have said, no way. They were just wiped out by 1511, they were gone. Now, with using DNA, what we find is that about 80% of native-born Puerto Ricanos are actually Taino in nature. So you can kind of see this, but again, it's modern technology that will do it. No, sorry, yeah.
You kind of glossed over a bit
Right.
when you were talking about the wars with Hooker and all that. John Mason.
Right.
Okay. I think we're going to have you can have a reinterpretation of his role in wars, given how merciless the Indians were.
Oh, yeah. Well, oh,
Against
yes.
the white settlers. So, what is his role now?
Well, Mason and Underhill both were basically soldiers of fortune. You ever hear John Smith, a guy in Virginia? Same thing. These were guys, if you look at their resume, Mason, in fact, and Mason's going to go back and fight in the 30 Years' War after this, and then come back to Connecticut and Massachusetts. But you find this with a lot of them. The guys that they got to actually do the fighting were really tough people. But when this all begins, right, most of this is really kind of the English kind of muscling in a little bit, trying to get that trade. When the Native Americans are going to find out that they're not leaving, because to the Native Americans, they don't mind if you stay a season in this area, but they're going to mind if you're in my area in a year. That's when the warfare is going to turn a lot different than it is. Now, Mason, for his part, I will tell you, Mason comes under a lot of problems with politics. And what I mean is that the statue I showed you, I'm going to go whipping through a lot of these folks. But if you remember, talked about Mason back here. Sorry. All right, there's Mason. This statue was originally in Mystic, Connecticut, essentially where the Pequot village was. They moved it up to Windsor because they didn't really want his statue in there. In the 1980s, you began to have this. It's not simply Confederate statues in the South that come under fire. The Native Americans really didn't like him being there because he did oversee, the attack on the Pequot village. So I'm not sure that you're going to get a reevaluation of him, not at least right now under present political circumstances. You may in the future. The thing about it is, right now, anything to do with Native Americans is so rife with politics that it's very, very difficult to really get anything, how would I say, anything that's really true, even approaching it, So, but you may find a reevaluation. We do it quite regularly in history. People get reevaluated all the time. That's right. But please.
The painting of the Pequot village, is that available somewhere to view?
No, I'm not really sure if it's, I think it's just an illustration that somebody made. You can see it's a much more modern one, it's kind of more realistic and stuff. There a couple of these, they're kind of tough, but they certainly weren't made by contemporaries, so. Yeah, please.
The development of the seaports and the harbors.
Right.
You started talking about that with this interaction with the Europeans and the Indians. Was it something that was more significant before the Europeans came, like Mystic and New York Harbor, and I don't know?
Well, you know what it is real estate's real estate. If you got a good deep water port, it's always good. But there was also the idea of divide and conquer.
Yeah.
When the English first went into the New Haven harbor, the first people they meet there are the Quinnipiacs. And they say, the Quinnipiacs said to them, you got these Pequot so-and-sos, we don't really want these people around, would you protect us? Sure. 20 years later, the Quinnipiac are gone. And then that's when it becomes New Haven. Its original name was Quinnipiac. But you had a lot of interaction like that. They would kind of stop on the way, but it's really the disease. If I wanted to move into this area and there's this many people living here, I'd have a tough time. But if suddenly 90% of people were wiped out, almost everyone's gone. You can just kind of come in. So it's tragic, but it also, almost every situation is kind of its own little variant on the same kind of thing.
Okay. Thank you.
Please.
Two things. First of all, the Narragansetts
Yeah.
were almost immediately wiped out.
Oh, yeah.
Because the British, didn't need, or the English did not need them anymore to help them against the other native
Yeah.
tribes. So they went after them immediately. The second thing is when people in the West start, screaming about the problems with the Native Americans, people in the East are not all that sympathetic because you got people like James Fenimore Cooper writing The Last of the Mohicans.
Yeah.
So all of a sudden, the Native American in the East is looking like the noble savage. So it's an interesting way that things change over time, and as the Native problem goes further away, the more,
you become friendlier, right?
Yeah.
Well, there's your reevaluation again, too. One of the things I would also say is by the time you're out west, that's 1860s, remember, you've also had things that are really hard to justify. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 under Andrew Jackson. It's a hard thing to justify just saying, you're out of here, especially when the Supreme Court said that no,
Right.
that the Cherokee are right, they should be able to stay, and Jackson said, have fun, I'm just going to do what I want.
Basically try and stop me.
Right.
The Supreme Court doesn't have an army.
Right.
And the thing is, they all knew it was because there was gold in them their hills at that
Oh,
point.
yeah. And, actually, the other thing is, too, strangely enough, ginseng. And down in the Cherokee area, ginseng, probably the best in the world. And it was a big thing. But, see, here's where that gets very complicated, though. The Cherokee in the 19th century, I mean, I don't mean to play Trivial Pursuit with anyone, but you know what their main source of income was? Is that they were slave catchers. So you tend to find it gets weird,
It really is.
Yeah, it's a the interactions are very strange, and very often you get this, especially today, that idea of the dances with wolves, that everyone's noble, I always liked, whenever you see an Indian council in movies today, everyone will sit there and, the elder will speak, that's not at all what an Indian council would have looked like. There would have been people shouting over each other all over the place. People were much more normal, but it's tough to get into that history because when people are normal, you're going to get into mistakes they make. You're going to get into their faults as well. And that, right now, that's very touchy for a lot of people,
So I'm sorry. So were a lot of the trade routes, the escape routes that the slaves used to?
Depends on where you are. If you're in a place like Virginia, let's say, and you what you want to do is get to the Ohio River,
Right.
because north of it you're going to have at least the route to Canada open,
Right.
which is where they were going. But generally speaking, a lot of times when people escape, they're going to basically go wherever they can go to get north. And that, that's where, if you've ever heard the folk song, Follow the Drinking Gourd, which talks about the North Star and how you should kind of guide on that. They also, a lot of times, they would have people who are African Americans themselves come back down into the South and guide people out. And that's people like Sojourner Truth,
Right.
which I've always been fascinated with, that takes, in my opinion, a lot of moxie, But there were also places you could go. For instance, if you were on a ship, captained by a guy from Mystic, let's say, and many of them were abolitionists by the 19th century, you could just kind of get on the ship and who knew? It's a stowaway. And then basically what happens in Connecticut is that the midnight or the Underground Railroad stops generally went up the rivers. So the Thames River, right, the Connecticut, the Housatonic, and so that's where, you generally find them. Until you got up, like in this area, you could come up to Naugatuck, but you'd get around, Beacon Falls or so, you just couldn't take to the river anymore. It was too shallow. And then they would kind of continue on foot. But it depends on where you were, really, and keep in mind, with the North, who had all of their merchant marine in the country, a lot of times it was shipborne traffic. You get people on, it's kind of smuggle them north, essentially.
Thank you.
Sure.
You mentioned how the tribes raided other tribes to increase the genetic diversity.
Yeah.
That brings up the genetics. Any hypothesis how they might have arrived at that conclusion that spreading out the diversity would maybe counteract some of the genetic abnormalities that they were seeing?
Yeah, actually, what you'd find is that Native Americans had no diseases that you and I would have considered normal in a European town. Measles, mumps, rubella, chicken pox, smallpox, none of these existed. However, Native Americans were they were very common to have dwarfism, cleft palate, and these are genetic, right? And they can be passed down. Also, autism was pretty big about them as well. I can't tell you an answer to that would be, that I know to be true. But I would say that more than likely they were like other people, which is they had strong taboos against, intermarriage, between close relatives, immediate family, for instance. And it's not hard to see what inbreeding does, because after a while it becomes kind of, passed down through the generations. But most people around the world have done the same thing. Even people in small areas like Polynesia, for instance, where you have small numbers of people. The Maori of New Zealand, they did kind of the same thing. Of course, you don't want to kidnap a man, right? Because men, they might escape. They might be able to wake up one night and kill somebody and get away. Women and children, it was a lot easier. Because if you brought a woman into a tribe, one of the things that you'd have, it's more than likely about twice as many people as you'd see in this room. But out of that group of people, say about 50 people or so, you would probably have about 5 single men. So you wanted the woman married off quick because you didn't want to create problems within the tribe itself. But once she was pregnant, she had full rights. All she had to do was learn how to speak well enough in the language, and she could do that. But a lot of that is really going to be, I think, based on this idea of the carrying on of tradition, the old tradition of just raiding for that kind of expansion of the gene pool.
And with the white, having people from European descent, the women might have be able to prevent some of the, bring the immunity to some of those diseases or make them not quite as bad.
Yeah, there was, in the beginning, the Native Americans often thought that conversion to Christianity would prevent that because, the Aztecs saw 1/3 of Mexico die between 1519 and 21 of smallpox, right? But the Spanish are walking around in these pestilential places and they're not affected at all. So the Aztecs kind of converted en masse, they just figured this was going to be the best way to do it. Of course, that didn't work for them, but, But I'm not sure, I don't think anyone's ever really done good research into what an infusion of European blood would have done to Native Americans in that fashion. That might be an interesting area to look into, actually. Well, folks, thank you once again for coming out.